Okay, Marcia's she'll be a little bit late, so I'm gonna go ahead and start the meeting then. Did everybody get the agenda? We're missing, I think, a couple of people. Nope, let's see. We're missing Marcia, and it looks like Melanie's here. Hi, Melanie, Julie, Trisha, Jonathan's here, Liz is here, Brian's here, Nicole's here. Oh, we did invite Rudy. Is he coming today?
Rudy is off today.
Okay, yeah, because we felt it would be really helpful, even though they're not on our committee, that Nicole and Rudy be here, because there's so much really good information that we're going through and what we're doing. So we wanted to make sure we invited them too. Okay, so with that said, let's go to our agenda. And basically, I think, Brian, we're going to end up, not Brian, but George, I think we're pretty much turning it over to you guys to take us through some information today that we need to go through and learn about. And we're pretty excited about that. Just looking at the first round of the spreadsheet. So,
yeah, okay. So yeah, we have a ton of information today, just like the last meeting. But saying the same as last meeting, this is information that we're gonna drill into even deeper and deeper throughout the process. So it'll be a reference document that we're building out. And of course, throughout this process, we're gonna try to educate as much as possible and try to tie a lot of it, to your data. That's the goal, is to, if we're talking about the student-centered funding formula, how does it apply to you and your district and your college? So, because it's no longer a simple formula, it's very complex and has, but it also has a lot of good information to help us kind of focus on which directions we need to go. So are there any questions regarding the last meeting before we pull up a PowerPoint presentation? Anything? Everything was clear, huh? Okay. All right. So Diana Keelan and I are going to kind of tag team the PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot of information, as you noticed, on the agenda. And then we have a comparison document that is really the high level picture of how your district is operating. So, and it's all based on data, and it's all trend data. So if we see data elements that are looking they're going in the wrong direction, we want to focus on how do we reverse that trend, right? So we have some that are improving, some that are not, some are trending in a negative direction. And at the end of the day, we want to figure out, not today, but at the end of this project, we want to have specific goals of how do we reverse trends in certain areas to a place where we're now sustainable and we understand what we're actually doing and how everything impacts each other. So Diana, do you want to start?
Sure.
She's got most of the beginning. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. A little under weather. I'm doing better. It's just a minor little cold, so just bear with me here. Today on the agenda, we're going to be going over the student-centered funding formula. We have a look at the first principle apportionment. We'll be comparing the full-time equivalent students funded versus reported, because we think that's an important topic to discuss how you've been funded versus what you've been reporting. We'll take a look at the supplemental trend review, the success trend review, and then we'll get into some compliance factors just to always keep at the forefront of our brain. There's some areas that we really need to be focusing on, and that is the 50% law, the full-time faculty obligation number, and the salary and benefits to overall expenditures ratio. And we'll get a little bit more into that. And then George is going to share some statewide system information, and then we'll get into the data comparison spreadsheet. For the student-centered funding formula, just a brief overview on the basics. It was implemented in 2018, 2019. Prior to that, you all had the SB 361 model, which was enrollment-based. Now the model originally intended to be split 70, 20, 10. 70% was enrollment, three-year rolling average of credit FTES. Also looking at the size of your college and the number of centers that you have and the size of centers that you have. And we'll show specific data for Santa Barbara Community College. And also the supplemental was 20%, and that was your head count of your AB 540 students, your Pell and your Promise students. And then the success allocation is 10%, and that's a 3-year average of head count for associate degrees, bachelor's degrees, credit certificates, transfer, CTE. And then there are supplemental rates in addition to the student success allocation if the student that was successful was a Pell student or a Promise student. So some of the challenges that we have with the information, and we wanted to, make sure that everybody understood, the data shifts. A perfect example is when you get your advanced apportionment for 22-23, it's using FTES, the credit FTES averages of 2019-2020 through 21-22. And the reason why is because 22-23 hasn't been reported yet. Advanced apportionment comes out in July, and you don't have P1 information until February. And so, at first, when you're looking at the apportionment advance reports, you've got those 3 fiscal years that you're dealing with. But then when P1 comes out in February, the 3-year average shifts to 2020, 2021 through 22-23. And then also your student success data also shifts because they don't have enough information at the time of your advanced apportionment. They use 2020, 2021 headcount in 22-23 advanced apportionment. But by the time you get to P1, it then shifts using 21-22 headcount data for 22-23. So just something to be aware of. When you're looking at the advanced apportionment figures, those are estimates. Those are based off of, a couple years back worth of data. And then as you start moving into February and P1, they have more current information that they use in the allocation formula.
Diane, I think we have a question from Cynthia.
Okay. Yes, Cynthia?
Yes, you mentioned, well, Pell Grant students or a Promise student, the number was different. And you mean Promise student as in one that has the CCPG, the California Promise Grant, not the SBCC Promise, right? Because to us, Promise students means something different.
Yeah, it's the former Board of Governor fee waiver students.
Okay,
And-
that's, yes.
yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Diana, can you blow this up or get rid of the slides on the side? You're still showing the,
I can try and do slideshow. When I did that before, it wasn't working, but let me, okay, I'm on the slide now. Can you see it?
no, it's not changing.
Yeah, that's the issue I was having before. So let me see if I can blow it up a little bit more.
Yeah, this one page is really a lot of info.
Yeah, it kind of has examples in there too, just to show, what happens with the data as it changes between advanced and P1. So if there's any questions on that, just feel free to bring that up. The point is, when you're doing advanced apportionment, you've got estimates of data that's not going to be the same data that you're using when you get to P1. The metric shift. You have more current information on your credit FTES, and you have more current information because then you have prior year head count for your student success metrics. So that's kind of the gist of this slide.
Yeah, I would add too that the consequence of that is we tend to have more one-time money at the end of the year than we did in the old model. Because it's very hard to reliably project all of this information at adoption, at budget adoption. So we're constantly, and maybe Brian can speak to this even in more detail in your own situation, although he's new there, that you tend to you're chasing numbers all year as opposed to back with SB 361, we had a better handle on estimating revenues because we're estimating revenues at the beginning of the year at budget adoption. So that's one of the consequences is one-time money.
Thanks. And I just would point out and remind everybody, we did email these out on Saturday to everyone, so everybody has a copy of this PowerPoint. I hope that helps because I always bring up the copy in my office so I can read it. I'm blind.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah,
sure.
Thank you. George, can you maybe hone in a little bit on this one-time money idea,
Yeah.
please?
So yeah, that's a great question. And so as we develop budgets, we really focus on two categories of funding. One is, or funds, I would say. One is the new money that comes in, or the traditional revenues that we're projecting that we're going to earn, right? And then that's what we build our budget off of. We also have one-time funds, whether it's additional money in the ending balance or some other form of revenues. So when we develop a budget, we have all these metrics that we use, whether it's percentage of compensation or whatever, as it relates to our fixed costs, et cetera, that we're not even sure we're not sure we're going to get all the money until we get about 4 or 5 months into the fiscal year. But what we do know is that once that budget is adopted, it's very difficult to put that money, any new money we see that year, out as an ongoing expense until the following year. So we're always with this lag, and you might hear complaints in the past of, well, we don't really know how much money we're going to get until 6 months after the fiscal year is over. So in that case, we would define that's just coming in a year and a half after we adopted the budget, and that's going to be one-time money as it comes in 18 months later, for example. The following year, of course, then once we understand what our revenues are going to be, then of course, then the new money coming in that's associated with that 1 year's of one-time money, then yeah, that's ongoing money. But so much of our revenue now, compared to SB 361, there's a lot of guesswork. And you'll see with the supplemental dollars, which is over 20% of our budgets, and then the success dollars, we don't know what those numbers are going to be even until February of the following year after our budget, the following calendar. So 6 or 7 months after we adopt a budget. So does that make sense?
Thank you, George. I believe it does. Who is we when you're talking?
We as a district, me and you and anybody
Yes, so basically all the districts in general.
All the districts,
the system.
The system, the field, the system, however we want to. When I say we, I'm talking on your behalf as a district. Yeah.
Yeah.
great, thank you.
Okay, and then what we wanted to do was show you what an apportionment report looks like. And so we have pulled your principal apportionment, your first period principal apportionment. And so this is the most current data that we have. The 320 for your P2 is due the 20th of this month. And so hopefully in May, you'll get your P2, which will have updated information, but this is the information that we have as of today. And we'll get further into the detail of talking about each one of these components. But the first that you have is base allocation, which is what we discussed, which was the 70%. And I'll show you what your district's metrics look like comparatively to that 70%. And you'll see it's about 74 million. Your supplemental allocation is a little over 11 million, and your student success allocation is a little over 11 million. There's 3 different ways that they've been computing revenue because of what has happened with the implementation of the student-centered funding formula, and then also with COVID. So the calculated scenario A, the 96 million that you see, you all are earning the most money utilizing the computed student-centered funding formula. The item B is 21-22 calculated revenue plus COLA. That's $89 million. And the hold harmless revenue goes back to 2017 plus respective COLAs, and that's about 86 million. So what they do is they compute these 3 different methods, and the highest method is what you all receive. And so right now you all are doing good under the student-centered funding formula. And so you're at about 96 million so far.
So keep in mind that the emergency conditions allowance is baked into that currently, which will go away at the end of this year. So we'll get into that a little bit more in detail, but that's not what you're reporting. It's what they're funding you at.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of the base formula, just to show you how they come up with your basic allocation of funding. This is before they compute your FTES. They say, okay, well, you're a district that's between 10 and 20,000 FTES. So you get a basic allocation of about 7.9 million. Plus you have 2 grandfathered centers, which have different varying FTES levels. And then they have a computation depending upon how many FTES levels they are in those categories. And so your centers are earning about 3.5 million. So your total basic allocation, aside from FTES, is about 11.4 million. And then when you do your funded FTES calculation, it's 62 million. So part of your basic allocation total is roughly 74 million.
So can I ask the question, and I'm sorry, it's been a while since I've been a CBO, George and Diana. Does the centers can be downgraded if they drop an FTS, correct? And isn't that like a 3-year average that would drop them?
Yeah, so I was gonna chime in on that too. So yeah, so right now you're getting, as a single college district, you're getting very, very close to that 10,000 threshold. You're just over 10,000. So if you were to drop below 10,000, then you have 3 years to make up the difference and get back to 10,000 or more. If you do not, then you'll drop down into the lower category, which is about $2 million in revenue. So that $10,000 threshold is a big deal, or 10,000 FTS threshold, sorry, is a big deal to Santa Barbara City. And that applies also to the centers as well. It's you have 3 years to grow back. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Melanie has her hand up.
Oh, Melanie has her hand up. Yeah, Melanie.
So just a quick question about that. Does that have to be 3 consecutive years that it goes up? What if year 1 it goes up, year 2 it drops down? Does it reset to year 1? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, it resets. So a lot of strategies there. So that's a good question. And that's the value of planning right there, because there's things you can do to make sure that you can retain that. But try to get let's reverse the trend on enrollment as much as possible and get far above 10,000 so we don't have to play those kind of games.
But theoretically, a school could, like, every 2.5, every 3 years, bump into the next category and then keep that category. Okay, I understand.
Yes.
That is not the goal. I'm clear that that's not the goal.
Okay,
I wanted to make sure I understood how it worked. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Brian's got his hand up, I see.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things I wanted to sort of say, if you go back to the total computational revenue slide, it's about 90 some million. And it's important to know, you see 96 something there. It's important for everybody to realize that our spending this year is around 112. And so the funding that we get through this process is only about 97 million. So when we hear of COLA, we still have, 15 million more dollars that's not funded by COLA. So our spending is not at this level. Our spending is this plus international students, plus about $5 million what we get in UGF that's not really directly associated with operations. So it's important to know that this is not all of it. So we get a COLA on this, it's a certain amount of money, but our spending is well that because we have $8 million worth of international students that are not in this. They don't get a COLA. Well, if we raise their fee and we grow it, there is, but it's important to know this is not all of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's when we talk about COLAs now, we talk about adding COLAs to the rates. And when Diana talks about the rates, that's very, very different. So as we know, by using basic mathematics, we can have a higher rate and a lower head count, for example, and actually not even receive the full COLA as an ongoing dollar. So keep that in mind too as we're going, and we'll talk much more about how that's been playing out across the state as well. So sorry, Diana.
No. This is good information. All right, and then next we've got the supplemental funding, and so you can see for the supplemental, you've got head count for 21-22, 340 students, and then multiplied by the rate, you've got roughly 400K in AB 540 students. Pell Grant recipients, roughly 2,600 for your head count, around $3 million that you're receiving for Pell Grant recipients. And then for Promise, you have about 6,800 head count, and that's about 7.8 million that you're receiving. So that's the makeup of the $11 million in the supplemental allocation that you all receive. For student success funding, there's three components to this. There's the student success piece for all students. And so this is everybody. And you can see it's got a 3-year average where it's averaging your 19, 20, 20, 21, and 2022, 21, 22 head count. And it averages these to the side and then multiplies it by the different various rates. And the rates are affected depending upon which one has the highest priority, basically up at the state. And so the one with the most points is your associate degree for transfer. Then you have your associate degrees. You all don't have a bachelor's degree program yet. Credit certificates next, transfer level math and English, transfer to a 4-year university, 9 or more CTE units, and then regional living wage. And you can see what the dollars are associated with each one of these. And again, these are a 3-year rolling average. So for all students on your success piece, you get about $8.8 million. And I can't see if people's hands are up. So George, if you notice someone's hand up, let me know, please.
Yeah, and we're watching.
Thank
We're watching.
Yeah, I started watching too. Sorry. And I would add,
Thank you.
Yeah, the awards for associate's degree for transfer, associate's degrees and credit certificates, those are applied to the highest award that your student receives. So a student can receive an associate's degree and an ADT, but you're only get funded for the ADT, whatever the highest award is. And we're going to explain why that is in a little bit later and see how that plays out.
Tricia, did you have your hand up?
Well, actually, I think I know the answer to it, but I'll ask anyway. So when you said all students, but you mean all credit students. So this does not apply at all to non-credit yet. That's a whole other formula, right? We talked about that last time.
Yeah,
So
there's
non-credit
right.
Students don't factor into this at all.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Correct.
Huh. Even the school size and everything. So we don't help boost. So it's completely we could have a million people in our program and it won't affect this at all.
Well, full-time equivalent students do apply. So it applies to your total. But there are no other elements of a fully non-credit student that apply to the supplemental or the success part, but definitely in the FTS.
Yeah, do count. Okay. I wasn't sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I was asking, are those teased separately or they are included? Okay.
Yeah, and so if you had 9,000 FTS of credit students and 1,000 FTS of non-credit students, then you would be a 10,000. You would be bumped into the 10,000 FTS, which is substantial when it comes to the basic allocation part. That's one of the conversations at the state. You know, they're trying to figure out how to incorporate non-credit students, but
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And can I please add something? So, and I also believe there's these two types of FTS for non-credit, and the ones that we traditionally have referred to as enhanced FTS, they are actually like having a much higher base rate for per FTS as the credit even, because and the non-enhanced. Could you give us the rates for these two, or did you already do that and I missed
Yeah.
it?
did you? I can do it, Diana, but I think you might have a slide that has the rates.
I think, yeah, I think we go into detail a little bit later on.
Later.
Okay,
Oh, great,
good.
great.
All right, that's fine then.
But yeah, that's an important aspect as well. So
And then you guys receive an extra rate for Pell recipients. And so you can see, I mean, you get about 1.1 million for your Pell recipients who also received what they call the success metrics. And then recipients are a little higher, about 1.2 million. So these are in addition to the all students category. You get a 2.2 million basically additionally because those students that were successful were Pell or Promise students. So this is the 11 million that's part of your success allocation.
So did everybody get that? So you're getting, if a student earns an award for an ADT, for example, or the district receives the funding for a student that earned an ADT, if that student is a Pell student and or a Promise or a CCPG student, then you get all of that revenue all 3 times. So it all compounds. So, and we're going to show some data in a little bit on how that's actually working out for you. Does that make sense to everybody?
So there is not this rule of only the highest.
Not only, yeah, only for the associate's
For this.
degrees, ADTs, and then credit certificates. Other than that, everything compounds on each other. And we'll give you some examples of that. It's important because it really speaks to how well or how much better we're doing with low-income students than we are with all other students that aren't documented as low income.
Okay.
And one of the most important things I want to share here with you all is just your change in compensation, composition of your SCFF revenue. So when it was implemented, 71% of your revenue was SCFF revenue, to be specific, was attributable to your base allocation, 16% was to your supplemental, and 12% was to your success allocation. And then if you move forward into 22-23 P1, you can see there's been a change. A lot of this is the base increase in funding that's been given over time. But now you're at 77%, which is your base allocation, 12% for supplemental, and you're still steady here at 12% for your success allocation. So you can see there's been a shift of about 5% from your base and from your supplemental over the last few years. So 77% of your total computational revenue in the SCFF now is base allocation and funding.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is the emergency conditions or the hold harmless elements because of COVID. Whereas they've protected the base allocation or your FTS with the emergency conditions allowance. They haven't protected the supplemental or success the same way. So success pretty much has stayed flat across the state, but supplementals, because the student counts have dropped so much across the state, those numbers continue to go down, and that's what's really skewing the whole 70-20-10 conversation. But hopefully that trend will start righting itself. And as soon as the ECA FTS are dropped at the end of 22-23, these numbers, these percentages will all change as well. So because there'll be a hold harmless dollar amount as opposed to a produced dollar amount. But
That's a really good point. Thanks for showing this chart and pointing it out what the ECA did to us.
And more on the ECA, we've got your reported versus funded FTES. And so you can see in 18-19, you know, over here is what you reported on your 320 reports, which is your attendance reports, versus what you were funded. The ECA didn't kick in here, but you can see just the difference between funded and reported. 1920, this is where they used the P1, first principal apportionment, because that's done in about February and March of 2020 is when COVID-19 hit. They used that as a baseline. And so you can see the funded piece is your P1 reported FTES. And then your final FTES was 13,007. And then in 2021, you can see your decline. You declined to 10,832 FTES, but you still were funded at the 12,614. Same things happening over in 21-22. You have protected FTES for the ECA funding, but your reported FTES is at 10,618. And then at your P1 for 22-23, you're still declining 10,441. And I think at P2, there's still an even slighter decline to closer to 10,400 FTES, but your funding right now is at 12,600. So you do have the benefit of it being a 3-year average. And so the 3-year average funding in the future is going to take into account the higher funded FTES versus your reported. That gives you some time to try and catch up on your enrollment, but not much, because once the ECA goes away, if you're not moving up in your enrollment, then that funding is going to take a hit. It's expected to expire next fiscal year, but you can see the difference in credit FTES, at least, and what you reported versus where you actually are funded is about 19%. So that's a significant amount of decline over the last few years.
Can I jump in real quick? This is Brian.
Sure.
Yes.
Go ahead.
On that, just so everybody knows, so that's 2,000 FTES. That's about $10 million. And that's the hurdle that it's not a cliff, but it's a pretty steep hill that will happen over time. Well, eventually they'll line up what they pay us for. And so, but that's 2,000 FTES for us. And I've heard that and that's 10 million. I've heard for LA, that's 130 some million dollars between what they're getting paid for and what they're generating. So somewhere in all of this discussion, there has to be sort of some too big to fail. As a system, we're all facing this. So it'll be interesting to see. Maybe you all know or, have heard more, but it does seem like we're in a pickle, but with a big group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that conversation could take up 2.5 hours, Brian. But I think, that's the idea of trying to right size the system over the next few years. But how do you survive without COLAs if you're in that camp? We have districts, the spread of FTS, a dollar amount per FTS in our system right now is so large that it has to come back to a normal. I mean, we've always had, you know, the real rural districts always got more per FTS because of their basic allocation was so high compared to overall FTS. But now we have districts that are at $8,000 per FTS, and we have districts that are at $17,000 per FTS. And at some point that has to come back to where, you know, the bottom ones are going to come up and the top ones are going to go down. I mean, we can't survive like that. But that's the conversation you're speaking of is how does that balance out over time, and how does Santa Barbara City fit into that picture? And we're going to figure it out with you. So, yeah. Are you there, Diana? Are you locked up?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
All right, and then taking a look at your supplemental trend, we went back to 17, 18, and then of course we don't have data for 22, 23 yet that's published. And, you know, looking at your AB 540 students, you all are down 36%. Statewide is about 25%. So you'll want to focus and look on what's going on there. Also with your Pell, you're down 35%, statewide about 20. And you're right on par with your Promise students. Statewide, they're down 28%. You guys are down 28% as well. And then we took a look at your success trends. Wanted to see, you know, line by line where you all are off compared to the state. And you can see for your associate degree for transfers, you all are down 35%. Statewide is about 18%. Associate degree.
Is that down or?
That's up. That's up. Sorry.
Come on now.
You're doing better here. You're doing better here. You guys are up 35%. Statewide's only 18. And then for associate's degrees, you guys are down 18%, but the statewide is 43%. So you're doing better than the state here. Credit certificates are about parallel. Transfer, math, and English statewide is up 85%. You all are up 54%. Doing good with transfer compared to the state. You guys are up 6%. The state is down 22%. And then you get into CTE, y'all are down 20%. The state is estimated at 8%. Regional living wage, you all are down 14%. The state is up 2%. So this is really good information to take a look at, you know, different pockets of what you compare to with the state.
Okay, good.
And then
Thank
if
you. We've got a hand. I'm going to get there. I'm just trying to let her finish her chart.
Oh, go ahead.
I had a question. Is part of the reason our associate's degrees, other than the fact that everybody's down, but our associate's degree is down so much is because our associate degree with transfer is up so much? I would think that would, if people continue to go on instead of just saying, oh, I have my associate's degree.
That's definitely a good trend. That's not a negative in any way. So it's a great trend. Yes. So you're right on track.
Okay.
All right, and then we took a look at your success trends for your Pell recipients to see where you fared with the state. And so, you know, with the associate degree for transfer, for your Pell recipients, you guys are up 16%, statewide's up 19%. You know, with being up with overall students, you know, you'd want to see why maybe your associate degree for transfer for Pell recipients isn't kind of higher than the state. Associate degrees themselves are down 4%, but with the state it's 44%. Credit certificates down 64%, with the state at 71%. Transfer, math, and English for your Pell recipients are 23% difference on the positive. Statewide, they're up 93%. Transfer is down 5%. Statewide is down 13%. So you're doing better than the state there. CTE, you guys took a hit of 25%. Statewide is about 8%. And with regional living wage, you all are down 11%, but the state is up 25%. So we'll need to pay some attention to the regional living wage and see what's going on there. Promise recipients, we took a look at this data and compared it to the state also. Associate degree for transfer, your difference is up 23%, statewide is 20%, so that's good. You're doing better than the state there. Associate's degree, you guys are down 7%. The state is down 43% for promise grant recipients. Credit certificates, you all are down 61%. The state is down 70%. Did someone say something? No?
Oh, you got your hand up, Cornelia?
Yes, I just have a question on the transfer math and English, because it is obvious that it's already on the last slide, on this slide again, that we are growing, but we're not growing as much as statewide. So my question is, can we separate that out for our institution to see which area might need more help, math or English, or they need both the same help? Because that's kind of like, I would love us to be number one. And
Okay.
It's exactly the strategies we want to agree on performing. So that's great. So yeah, that would be the next step. Or do we need help in math, or do we need help in English? So
yeah,
perfect.
Great, thank you. Appreciate these observations. Keep going.
okay. And then transfer, you guys are up 7%, but the state is down 20%. And with CTE, you're down 20%. The state is down 9%. So you'll want to look at your CTE programs. Regional living wage, you're down 17%, but the state is up 20%. So this is all really good data to take a look at and really dive in to find out, why are there some significant differences with Santa Barbara Community College versus what's going on with the state? What are the nuances that are happening, particularly with your community? And so, this is just right now we've got the data, and then we can talk about strategy development like George was saying. Are there any questions so far on the student success funding formula?
And all of this data, by the way, is published at P1, P2, and R1, which is the recalc. So it's all available to everybody to look at other districts, the statewide numbers, your own data. One great thing that came out of the SCFF was that we've gotten a lot more data related to student success. And then as long as we're all going to define student success in the same way that we are funded, then we're all in good shape. But if we don't, then we have things to work on or consider differently. So go ahead, Diana, unless there are other questions.
We just appreciate having it in one location and already put in some charts for us to be able to start with. So thank you.
Okay, next we're going to talk about some compliance topics because, while we're talking about strategies, we have to keep in mind that there are certain, parameters that we have to live within. One of them is the 50% law. Gets a lot of attention. It was enacted in 1961, and it basically requires that half of the money that gets spent in your unrestricted general fund has to be used for salaries of classroom instructors. So that's the number Brian was talking about, aside from just the funding that you get from the student-centered funding formula. All the other pockets of money in your unrestricted fund, they get included as part of your current cost of education and expenditures. And then there's a calculation that's done to calculate classroom instructors. There are some exemptions, and they're pretty significant for a lot of colleges under the 50% law, and we'll get into that a little bit further along. The calculation is done during the CCFS 3 reporting cycle. That is a big financial report that's due in October every year. It's a consolidated financial statement. The auditors use that. And something that I like to really communicate to people is the 50% law. Just because the business office, does the 311 doesn't mean that they're responsible for the 50% law. That is something that has to be adopted institutionally to be looked at. Everyone is responsible for the 50% law. Since you're making hiring decisions, purchasing decisions, all of those are factors in making sure that you're compliant with the 50% law. And it does get audited and is scrutinized every fiscal year. Some of the challenges with the 50% law is you have counselors and librarians that are considered faculty, but they aren't counted. So when you hire a counselor or a librarian, they actually add to your current cost of education and do not help with the numerator portion of the 50% law. There's been significant pension increases in CalPERS for the employer obligations. Those are part of the current cost of education. Since this was adopted in 1961, it does not take into account current advancements in technology. So instructional technology is not included in the instructional portion, and neither are instructional materials. And so we also have a new funding model that is, based on supplemental metrics and success metrics, that some of that has to do with areas outside of, academic instruction. A lot of that has to deal with student services. And unfortunately, even though we have a new funding model, we don't have a new expense model to help with that. So those are some of the challenges with the 50% law. And taking a look at your district, I've did a 4-year trend, and it looks like you all have been really good, but you're going down in your 50% law. So we're doing an analysis for your 22-23 fiscal year, and then making sure that we look at your out years too, to keep that in balance and to make sure that you're still compliant. But there's a lot that goes into the 50% law. There's a lot of nuances with the exclusions of the 50% law. But the key is, every time you're making a budget or you're, doing budgetary type, decisions, you want to make sure that you're keeping a track on what's going on with your 50% law. Are there any questions?
I just wanted to make a comment, Diana and George, is that we're in the process of trying to hire 24 full-time faculty right now. So for the 23-24, when you're looking at the out year, that'll have to be thought about. I can already tell you, we probably have 2 failed searches, so it'll only probably be 22, but it may not even be that. So just a heads up on that.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions on the 50% law before we move forward to the font? Okay, full-time faculty obligation number. This was established back in 1989, and it was part of AB 1725, and it, wanted to make sure that anytime you grew in credit FTES, that you had a full-time faculty obligation number that went with it. There's also some instances where it can be reduced if there's lack of funding. But things to keep in mind are, accepting emergency conditions allowance funding affects your FON, because now you have a higher funded FTES level. And then, knowing that you get an advanced FON in November, and then you have your P2 that you report for your FON, and the lower of the two are what becomes your compliance FON. So advanced FON is given in September. The prior year FON reports are due in November. If there's inadequacy or adequacy of funding, it gets decided in November. Any penalties, and I think it was about $88,000 per faculty member, that, if you didn't meet the FON, it would be multiplied by that number as a penalty. And then in June, the P2 is issued and your compliance FON for the next fall is issued. So what's included in the FON? I put together this schedule because I was trying to figure out what was included in the FON versus the 50% loss. So we've got a chart here that, hopefully tries to make it a little bit more easier to understand. But there's a lot of rules and regulations that govern the FON. What's included is instructional assignments, non-credit is not included. Non-instructional assignments are included. Overload is excluded. Sabbaticals and unpaid leave are included. Teaching by classified or management are excluded. Late retirements, if they meet, the certain requirements are included. And full-time faculty funded by categorical programs are included in the FON. But if you want to know what's included in the FON versus the 50% law, you can kind of see here what the differences are. And mainly the 50% law uses actuals and does not include any of the grants or categorical programs. When we talk about the 50% law, it's just your general unrestricted fund. It doesn't include any of your restricted programs.
Marcia has a question.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Well, it has to do with both the FON and the 50% law. And I'm curious if in January or thereabouts, we get an annual expense of education per FTES from the Chancellor's office. And I'm kind of curious how that relates to these calculations. Is it a whole different set of calculations and assumptions, or are there similarities, big picture?
January, the cost per FTE, I'm not sure where that comes from. Are you?
It's for purposes of setting the fees for international and out-of-state students.
Yeah. So it's a completely different, that looks at a statewide average. That was kind of what I was looking at, and I kind of brought up a little while ago about how different our system is now in terms of FTS per, let me get this right. So dollar amount per FTS, but what actually they're looking at is the current expense of education only. So Diana, can you go back one slide? I think it's one slide. This might be helpful. Maybe one more. It's on the 50% law. One more. One more, sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, so on the second bullet, it says the 50% law requires all community college districts to spend at least half of their current expense of education. So that's the term that all the county office of educations use that really identifies the cost of education for that specific district. And they'll take that number, divide it by, in our case, 30 units, and then it'll come up with that dollar amount. So I think we passed up the $300 per unit threshold at a lot of districts this year. So does that make sense? But it's completely different than the items that Diana's talking about.
Okay. I'm curious at some point whether that is something that tells us where we are relative to the statewide and the other colleges. That would be useful, or perhaps not. So go on with the great word, but that might be useful information too.
Okay, we could take a look at that.
Yeah, well, let us dig into that to see if we can get a statewide report that has all 73 districts, and then we'll get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Cornelia has a question.
Yeah, quick question on the previous to last one back. I think one more back. So you have these three columns, FON, 50% law, and 75-25. I'm a little bit confused. I thought the FON is a direct output of the 75-25. It's not?
No. Completely different.
Yep, totally different.
So the 75-25 rule, they call it, was implemented with the FON at the same time as part of AB 1725, but it's a target and it was never funded. So that's why we're starting to see some full-time faculty money to try to help with that. The problem is they haven't changed the ruling on the FON. So basically for about every 60 FTS that you create of credit FTS, the FON will raise by 1. But FON is a head count. It's not a full-time equivalent. So there's a lot of discrepancies in trying to figure that out. So, but that's the 75-25 rule has never really been fully funded. It's more of a target.
Yeah.
And the state does measure each district to see how well or not we're doing, but it was just never really funded.
Okay, so, sorry, so the 75-25 is just a reporting, whereas the fawn and the 50% is a requirement where we're getting in trouble if we don't meet it.
That's a great way to define it. Yes.
Got
Yes.
it, got it. Now it's, I was just a bit confused. Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
All right, and then what gets excluded from the fawn are part-time faculty that replace full-time faculty on sabbatical, those that are backing up those who are reassigned, part-time faculty who replace full-time faculty on unpaid leave, and then those who resigned or retired in accordance with the Ed Code 53-309. And then any part-time faculty funded by a parcel tax, they get excluded as well. And here's a trend for Santa Barbara Community College. And just to point out, you know, the big increase that you had in the fall of 19 was that there was funding for 17 faculty that were added. You can see the difference of what your compliance fawn is versus your funding fawn. And right now we're at advanced fawn. We don't have a compliance fawn yet for fall of 23. We're still waiting for P2 to come out. But the big difference that you can see here, and I'll get into that, is you received funding in 21-22 for 13 full-time faculty, at least funding for that. So that affected your fawn. It drove it up.
So Diana, can I ask a question? So
Sure.
when the emergency conditions ends in June of this year, so their fawn, and this is a timing question that we're all going to learn together, hopefully. Their fawn will actually drop by whatever's 2,000 if their FTS doesn't increase. 2,000 divided by 60. What is that? About oops. I don't know what that is. About 33, their compliant number will be about 33 less than the 211. Do they still, is Santa Barbara or anybody still on the hook for P2 if they're going to see that large of a drop of credit FTS in the fall of 2023? That's my question.
Well, it would adjust as it would be the 3-year average of the FTES that gets reported. It wouldn't be that big of a drop.
So it'll be a third of that would drop. So a third of 33. So it might drop by 10 or 11 or something like that. Okay.
And how is it?
Okay, Marcia, then Cornelia, then Brian.
I was just going to say, and how are we then funded when that drops for the faculty?
So a couple of things. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Diana. So the full-time faculty funds are included in your basic allocation ongoing moving forward. So the funding it all comes through the SCFF. So if a district is over, say in your case, you were funded for approximately 15 full-time faculty members. And if you're over 15, there's no obligation to increase by 15. There's just your obligation number increases and you have to stay above that. So each district can make that decision on how they want to manage that, but you still get the funding.
Even if our fund drops by, say, 11?
Yes.
We get the funding for the 11 over what's required.
Well, you don't technically get FON funding. It's just part of your basic allocation or your base allocation in the SCFF.
Yeah, so Marcia, in 2019, we got, I think, a little over $500,000 for funding for full-time faculty. I think they showed that. And then in 2022, we accepted the $1 million that came in for funding, and that's the 13. So that is wrapped into our base now. So it doesn't go away, it's in our base. And we were anticipating that potentially with the ECA going away, our fund might drop a little bit. We're just hoping that we come in just about right, because we just went over a little bit on our hiring to make sure that we have enough for fund.
Yep.
Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
George,
And just to go ahead.
George, could we go one slide back, please?
Was that go one slide back? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I'm a little bit confused. In fall 2022,
Mhm.
we had 202 live body full-time faculty. How can we report a fund of 206?
So
We had retirees. I can already tell you, I can show you the calculation. We had people who retired within the 45-day time frame from the prior year. And that was why. And then we had another faculty that was hired right after the beginning of fall. So that was, I can show you the numbers on that.
Okay, the 45-day.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's probably making the difference, because we only
So-
have 202 live bodies, right? Okay, got it.
I'm very impressed that you knew that you have that much detail. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we did. Unfortunately, the cabinet got to do the fund calculation this year together to make sure we all knew what was going on.
That's
Oh,
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Diana, make sure you leave me some time for my
Okay, Brian has a question, and then
Go ahead.
As we go forward with the hold harmless, and if we don't increase our enrollment or our other factors to bring up our funding, does the fund continue to fall then over the following few years? If it goes down 11 next year, it'll continue to go down until eventually, and this is my understanding, until eventually it rests on what our actual FTS generation is. Isn't that right?
That's correct. As long as you stay flat, yeah.
Right. So some districts, with that in mind, had, because if you don't meet the fund, you have to essentially pay equivalent funding back to the state.
Mhm.
So rather than hire people and then later, be over their fund, did not hire them, and we're going to make those payments to the state. Is
That, or they didn't accept the emergency conditions allowance to keep their FTS down.
Thank you.
Yes. And the $88,000 penalty is the difference between a full-time total compensation and a part-time total compensation. So that's where they get the 88,000. It's not to pay for a full, the total cost or total compensation of a average full-time faculty member.
Okay, and this kind of shows you an example of what happens when they determine that there isn't funding. You can see that there's a revenue deficit that gets applied. So you started at 222.1. You've got your funded FTES and your projected FTES, but there's a deficit, a revenue deficit, because they didn't anticipate full funding. And so that reduced your fund by 1. So you're at 221.1 at advanced. Really good conversation though regarding the fawn. I'm going to jump to salaries and benefits to expenditure ratio just to give George enough time at the tail end of this presentation just to go through this because these are some other areas I keep an eye on as decisions are being made. The statewide budget practice is that no more than 85% of your expenses should be salary and benefits related. And the reason for that is that leaves about 15% for other items, the cost of just turning on the lights and opening the doors, any attorney's fees, and those kinds of expenditures. If you guys have debt payments, those are included in the 15%. There are 2 areas that measure the looking at the 85% ratio. That's the ACCJC. They have a composite financial index, and one of the criteria that they look at is if a district is going over that 85% number. And then FCMAT, which is the Financial Crisis Management and Assistance Team, they have a health risk assessment analysis that they do whenever they have to come in and look at districts. And one of the areas that they look at in that checklist is whether or not districts are staying within that 85% ratio. So just something to keep in mind. You know, looking at your trends going all the way back, you can see there were a couple of troublesome years that you had. 2021, you were at 90%, which is pretty high. And then you got it brought back down to 21, 22. And then in 22, 23, you adopted a budget with 83%, but there is an appropriation for contingencies in there. And I think that that's for set aside for funding that has to deal with salaries and benefits. And so if that ends to fruition, you want to keep paying attention to that, because that could leave you at 88% at the end of the year if no other changes are made to the budget. Any questions on that? Okay, George, you're up.
All right, so I'm going to spend just a couple minutes on the last few slides, and then we're going to get into the data, the big spreadsheet that is a comparison that we are working on. So hopefully at this time we're starting to write down some not questions, but things we want to go check out. We want to dig into a little bit deeper. Maybe you can do that internally. Maybe we'll participate in that, et cetera. But when we start to look at, you know, we don't want to just have presentation after presentation. We want to actually commit to something. But I always like to start with this slide, and we've talked about the funding formula, the different regulations, laws, rules, et cetera. But I think we have to understand where our support system is in our system. So right now it's currently the student-centered funding formula. So that in the categorical programs that support the outcomes of the student-centered funding formula, right? So we have unrestricted funding that we earn, and then we have restricted funding that would help us improve our outcomes, whether it be any of the different areas. So the rule is that the further we stray away from understanding or following or liking the student-centered funding formula, the more financial challenges we'll have. So for example, we want to, some districts are like, well, I don't want to kind of follow the student-centered funding formula because, and you can go to the next slide, Diana, because that doesn't really represent what we view as a success, right? So you hear these conversations all the time, and that's fine. You can do that, but it'll be a little more challenging as a district, as a college, to capture the revenues that you're going to need to compete and help students succeed, et cetera. So are there any conversations district-wide that go against the conversation regarding our support system, the student-centered funding formula, the categorical programs, et cetera? Because that, if we have to have that kind of conversation, like sometimes they'll say, we'll hear, well, we don't get funding for this success, but we're going to do it anyway. Or we don't believe that a success, you know, that the only way to judge success are by the, you know, the 9 different elements of the SEFF, et cetera, which are fine. But sometimes they become overpowering in the conversation at a district. So I just want to make sure that I fully understand, and this is always a better conversation face to face. I get it, but that I understand, and that our focus is going to be on how do we capture revenue and et cetera, the way that the state intends us to capture it. So am I making any sense at all in these comments? Maybe it's like, does that make sense? Okay, I'll just keep going, but think about it. And if we do need to have conversations about that, then those are fine. And there's everybody, you know, we can all have our own ideas. I just want to make sure that everybody sees that if we become too unique, then it's very challenging to pay our bills and pay people enough to retain them and recruit, et cetera, et cetera. So like, for example, San Francisco, they may want to do all these unique things and chase after what they believe is a success, which is fine, but you become too unique. So anyway, we'll get, if that conversation needs to be had, just let me know and we'll work through that. So statewide
George,
data.
I have two hands up.
Oh, okay. I didn't see
Liz
that.
and
Sorry.
Marcia. Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but how does non-credit fit into this? Is a degree and certificate just for credit?
So non-credit in terms of
Our SEL programs, the ones that are just for like adult learners and that kind of thing.
so how does it fit into revenue?
To the funding formula.
Oh, well, it's definitely, you're talking about FTES based.
So that they only capture FTES. They don't capture the other two things.
Correct. And that's one of the conversations is they're trying to bring in elements of non-credit success.
So if we arranged it so we had degrees and certificates then, or at least certificates in SEL, would that count, or does this degrees and certificates have to be credit?
Right, unless it's an enhanced non-credit program of study.
Okay.
Then those are funded at a higher level. But I do know that that's one of the topics they're trying to incorporate into the SCFF.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I would note that I believe Vice President Smith has been having conversations about how to use the enhanced credit better, because you get the full rate of funding for FTS if it's what we call CDCP, Career Development College Placement. So
CDCP.
those are the enhanced ones. So good question, Liz.
Right. And then they're also talking about how to transition to rewarding the colleges in transitioning non-credit students into credit programs of study. So that's another area that they're trying to incentivize the colleges to, have more non-credit students be more successful, et cetera.
I just hope that all the courses we have for older adults don't say it's a specialized program, so we shouldn't be doing those. I just want to be sure where they fit in, that they do fit in.
Yeah. No, I think every institution gets to decide. And you have a long history of non-credit programs and non-credit in general serving your community. So in no way are we saying that something is not valuable or not. We're just
okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry if I came across that way. So.
Marcia?
Yeah, I agree with Liz. I mean, I was pretty much asking the same question, that when we have these conversations about what gets paid for and what is unique, that we remember to factor in what is paid for with non-credit and the ways in which we can maximize that and or support that if the state is not yet including it in their thinking about the student success formula. Because it is an important program for our community in many ways.
Yes.
Tricia?
Just a quick add-on. So yeah, I remember we talked last time about how there's like a separate funding formula for non-credit, and they were working on it, but it always gets delayed. But for the certificates, I do know I'm on the curriculum advisory committee. So we have quite a few certificates that we've created in the last several years, especially with career development, and I teach adult high school GED that counts as enhanced funding. So yeah, definitely. But then you're right, we don't want it. The other programs that don't have certificates are very valuable too. So, but it's just all putting it all together.
That's right. Everything in balance. Yeah, because technically, if you have a really robust non-credit program and have a lot of CDCP, you're organized and structured. That's what allows you to do all the other things. And your dollar per FTS would probably end up being higher than traditional 3-year credit average. So there's a lot of analysis to go on, and I think that's, I'm looking at your CDCP numbers and they're pretty high. So that's good. So, all right, so the next slide is just some statewide data. So we have about you can go back to that. Yeah, so we have about 1.8 million students, if you trust Datamart, in our statewide database. And then, so I'm going to play a little game in the next few slides, just so you can see how you can kind of use this data, dig in a little deeper. The state is defining success as a degree or certificate, and they, there's also a lot of other certificate or other successes, but that's the one that pays the most money. So I'm just kind of focusing on it right now. And then we also have our system is really a low income priority system. If you look at how much money is pumped into the SCFF, we're defining it as a state as low income versus not low income, or documented low income versus not documented low income. However you want to do it, however you want to say it, but that's what we really start wanting to kind of understand. So the question is, who are the remaining students? So go to the next slide, Diana. So if I look at statewide data, we know that since almost every Pell Award is included in the CCPG award, because if you're an in-state Pell recipient, you also get the CCPG award. So you get it twice. So this is the low-income student. If we can document them, is a huge amount of money. You're going to get over $2,000 for each one of those students, in addition to any FTS or any awards. But in our system, we have about 723,000 documented low-income students. So that's about 40% of our student body. We hear that number quite a bit at state meetings. So that means we have just over 1 million, or 60% of our students, they're not verified as low income. So they could still be low income. We're not sure, but we just don't have any documentation and tie them to a Pell or a Promise or a CCPG award. So next slide. So if we look at the statewide data, so 146,000 or 8% of our students earned a degree or certificate. Their highest award was a degree or certificate. So that's about 8%. So about 107,000 or 14.8% of our low income students earned a degree or certificate. So success in our system is much, much higher if you're a documented low income student. So that means, and this is all on the Exhibit C, statewide Exhibit C, which we can send out. You can stare at it like we do if you want. So that means there's only 38,739 awards being issued that are given to non-low income students, or 3.6%. So it begs the question, like, who are these non-low income students? Melody, you have your hand up.
Thank you, George. My question is, how or does dual enrollment factor into this? How does this?
So dual enrollment it factors into the FTES. They get a promise waiver, but they're not funded in the dollar amount the district receives for the supplemental, the BOG waiver or CCPG. So although they get fee waivers, we don't receive the extra funding because we're getting a higher FTS rate, where we get a fully funded rate for FTS tied to special admit students or concurrently enrolled students. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wanting to make sure they don't in a way count against us for earning degrees and certificates. So
if they earn a degree or certificate, you still get that award.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's nuances throughout, like the math and English first year award. So they can earn that as a high school student, for example, but as soon as they become an adult student, that triggers it and you get the funding for it. So yeah, it's the first year that they become an adult student, whatever that is. So anyway, we got a big discrepancy statewide between low income success, if we define success by a certificate or degree, and non-low income. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, and Cornelia had a question.
Yeah, real quick, what's the dollar amount per FTES for a dual enrollment student? Just for the,
Yeah, so it's going to be I got it right in front of me. It's going to be a dual enrollment student. We're receiving this year $6,737.06 per full-time equivalent student.
so that's the same as for the enhanced non-credit?
Absolutely. And incarcerated if you have incarcerated students. Yeah.
Thank you.
As opposed to the 3-year average credit is 4,840. So a big difference. That's why we're seeing our largest increase in population in special admit or dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment students across the state.
Okay, Tricia, and then we gotta let George finish up because we've got 7 minutes.
Yeah.
For the low income, that are non-credit students included in that as well? If the non-credit
No.
students are certificate? No, not at all. Okay.
No,
'Cause I'm like,
these
how
are
do we
all credit.
capture
Yeah,
them?
I
All
took them
credit.
out. Yeah. So then I did the exact same thing. Can we go to the next slide? For Santa Barbara City. So you had about in data mart, about 19,000 unduplicated head count credit students. Does that sound about right? That's what's in data mart currently. So you can see the awards. You're about 36% of this, and the statewide average is 40%. So your assumptions are correct. You have fewer non-documented low-income students than the statewide average. And that hurts you financially as it relates to the supplemental awards. And then you have about 12,000 or 65% that are not verified as low income. Next slide.
65.
So if I follow the same methodology, you have of all of your students, your credit students, you have about 8% success rate earning a degree or certificate. So you're right in line with the state. In low income students, you're actually just below the state average of 14.8%. You're at 13.7%. But what's interesting is for your not low income students, documented low income, you're a little bit higher than the state average at 14.9%, as opposed to 3.6. So still, we have a big discrepancy between our non-low income students and our low income students as it relates to a percentage. So the question is, do we want to look in to figure out why we have such a difference? Because we know we have a lot of categorical support for low income students. Is that the difference? Is it because we have a lot of university students taking 1 or 2 classes and they don't really finish anything? If so, is it because our low-income students all have ed plans, but the rest don't? Is it a combination of all of this? Is this something that we want to look into? That's the $1 million question. And you don't have to answer right now. Just make it on your list. And we want to look into that because this is, it's a big difference. And it's not just Santa Barbara City, it's everywhere. So, but it would be nice to, I have a note here that says, update the slide. It's sharing slide 39.
That's the right one.
Yeah, that's the right one. Okay, we're done now, but I want to pull up, if there aren't any questions, I want to pull up the data comparison sheet and spend the next couple minutes on it. Because this is really what we're going to be referring to. And I apologize, it's a lot of data and hopefully you printed it out when we sent it to you. But I'm going to share my screen and make it as big as I possibly can for you. As I walk through it. So, can you see that well enough? And I can slide it over. That's about as big as I can do it without cutting it off too much. Are we okay? And you have a copy of it. So you'll be able to refer to it, and we'll be referring to it for weeks, just so you know. Okay, so what this is, the title of it, it says it's a comparison. It compares staffing, salary and benefits, revenue, classroom efficiency, fawn, all kinds of different information. So I'm going to blow it up and I'm going to walk through the categories on the left-hand side. So the first section is FTS that you're producing. And you notice we broke this out, or you'll notice as you spend some time on it, on primary terms and summer. And we have to do this because primary terms really is we really focus on permanent employees as it relates to faculty, et cetera, or contract for primary terms. And it also eliminates the confusion because of the summer shift. I can see you guys still did a few summer shifts even after the SCFF was implemented, and we'll talk about that more later and probably during like budget development and stuff like that. So it's broken out in non-credit, CDCP. You don't have any instructional service agreements. So these would be types of instruction that you're contracted out to somebody else to deliver. And then you're really sharing revenues in that case. And then incarcerated, you have a small amount of incarcerated. And then that's all the non-credit sections. And then we have the credit sections. That's why we like to keep them separate. This goes all the way back to 2014-15. You can see that it is about a 9-year trend. 2020, 2022, and 23, we're working on estimates right now. Once we get the P2 information that's due in a couple days, we'll put that in here as well. Okay. The next section is this section right here. This is classroom efficiency. So this is really just tracking our average class size and our FTS per FTS efficiency number. So you've heard this as 17.5 is the goal, et cetera. So in 14-15, you were at 15.39. And then come 21-22, we were down to 12.78, et cetera. We're working on 22-23 right now. But so this would be one that we would like to just reverse that trend a bit over time. The next one is your section counts. And these are your total counts. And then in your case, I think we'll break it out and verify the non-credit versus credit conversation on as many of these as we can, so we can have that information. And then the next section is our fawn, which we just went over. So this is trending our fawn. The next section is staffing. This is where we're waiting for most of the remaining few items. We break out contract or full-time teaching. We look at overload. We look at overload FTEF. There's several items that we'll plug into here. The number of positions for non-contract or adjunct part-time. Please let us know what term you use so we can use it in our spreadsheets. And what that looks like as a trend. Then we have other staffing. We get into management staffing, staff. If there's another category, if you want to separate it out by confidential, et cetera, we can do that. We have unduplicated headcounts, and then we have full-time equivalent headcounts. So that's important because a lot of our managers and staff are funded by both unrestricted general fund and categorical or restricted general fund. And we just like to see that trend. So you can see a lot of zeros here. We're still waiting on HR information. And then this gets into our total revenues, compensation, other types of financing that we have, or other local revenues, et cetera. CalPERS, CalSTRS, health insurance, other benefits, supplies, operating expenses, and capital outlay, and then things like OPEB and those other requirements. And then we trend them all out and we start to see trends, which ones are going up, which ones are staying flat, which ones are aligning or level with revenues. You know, if we see revenues coming in at 20% higher, but all other expenses are 25% higher, clearly we have to identify which areas seeing large increases. So clearly pension reform, when you see a number like 200 or 150% increase for CalPERS, it's going to take a hit on the budget. 88% for CalSTRS. So we start to see just in compensation, total compensation, we have a 21% increase in revenue, but we have a 50% increase of total compensation. But people weren't making that much on their salaries, right? It didn't all go to salaries. It's going to everything else. So this is all very, very important to kind of look at in terms of, you know, at the end of the day, we want to be able to pay competitive wages, recruit nicely, retain nicely. So this is kind of the information we look at, and I'm out of time. I'm sorry for going over. But we are going to dig into this spreadsheet more and more each meeting. And you probably have a million questions because I covered way too much in 5 minutes.
Liz has her hands up, and then we're gonna.
Yeah,
need to-
I don't seem to be able to find the spreadsheet in what I received. So can you send it to me again?
Yeah, I got it up. I'll resend it to everybody. again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No
Um,
problem. I'm sorry. I sent it on Saturday.
Yeah. We were trying to get some last minute information to put into it, and we just couldn't get it validated. So we figured it's best to introduce it, even though it's not complete. But once again, anything you see in any of these documents, if you know, please, we want to dig in deeper. Actually, we want you to dig in deeper, and we'll help you do it, because that's the way the institutions can really improve, by taking it upon themselves to dig in deep, come up with ideas, and really try to reverse some of the trends, because we all had good years. You know, we just have to get back to when that was in terms of balance and et cetera. Melanie?
If we have questions between now and our next meeting, do you want us to send them to you, or to who should we send those to?
Yeah, I think we'll leave that up to I'm happy to do that, but I think there's a lot more value if everybody sees it. So Kindred.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
Jonathan?
why don't, yeah, let's have them all come in to Brian and I, and then we'll just put a list together in Google Docs. Actually, I think what we'll do is just put a Google Doc in Google Doc that says questions for the committee. That seems to be what works well at Santa Barbara.
Perfect. Yeah, that's
Okay.
perfect. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And
All right. Sorry for going over again, but we did get a lot of info out there, and we're gonna keep plugging away.
Every
you.
minute well spent.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Thanks. All right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one. All
All
right.
right,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really